Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining me once again. It is said that in English language, there are three words which are most difficult for us to utter. And the three words are, I am sorry. Every society, every human being, every part of the world, throughout history, has struggled to take responsibility for their actions. And these actions sometimes are hurtful to other people. They are hurtful to our members of our own family, people in our institutions as our colleagues, people in our nations and communities and tribes, people of other nations. So today's presentation is about the importance of apology in international diplomacy and in families. It's a very delicate topic, and it distinguishes greatly from other animals. All these various presentations that I have made to you so far, I have tried to impress upon you that we human beings are quite distinct from other animals. And one of the things that distinguishes us very, very clearly is that we have a different way of resolving conflicts. In the animal kingdom, it's a well-known phenomenon called fight and flight. When two animals fight with each other, whether they're of the same species or different species, and they fight with each other, and when one of them notices that he cannot win, he runs away. He flies away, runs away, takes flight. So it's a phenomenon called fight and flight. In human beings, we also do the same. We fight with another country, we fight with another tribe, we fight with our neighbors, and sometimes you come to a conclusion you won't win. So forget it. So move on. So, but really in human beings, we don't move on. We have a phenomenon of fight and flight, but we fester about it. We keep thinking about it. And we say, one day I'm going to get him. One day I'm going to get him. It may take 5 years. It may take 500 years. And sometimes it may take 1,000 years. You say, but one day I'm going to get him. So this festering sense in human beings creates many things in our hearts and minds, in our souls. What happens to us, to our being? So these are the things I'm going to share with you today. And I'm going to start with a very personal incident in the life of a friend at a seminar in Toronto some 10 years ago. I was attending a session about apology, about sharing our lives with other people. And there were about 150 people in this seminar. This is a 3-day seminar. And I was one of them. And people were coming and sharing their lives with others and saying what is holding the energy of their life back? Why can't we live fully? Why is our life force frozen sometimes? So people were sharing their lives and trying to find out what can be done to unfreeze ourselves. So on the 3rd day of this seminar, a woman came in front of the group. And before she arrived, she was already, you could see from her gait, she's already trembling. She seemed very nervous. And all these 3 days, she had not shared anything at all. And she comes in the front of the group, and she starts crying. And she says, I want to share this. And yet I have never shared this for the last 50 years. I want to share this. I can't hold it in my heart anymore. And she was 54 years old, she said. And she said at the age of 4, she was sexually abused by her grandfather. And the grandfather is dead for 20 years. But she can't forgive him. And then, 10 years later, her father assaulted her. And she says now, she shared more. She was crying, as all of us were deeply touched by her story. And she's crying, and she's saying more, and that she has 2 sons. She has a husband. But she looks at every man with this feeling that they are potential rapists, and that she can't relate to any man, any male. And she does not know what to do about it. Now, she was 54 years of age, and for all intents and purposes, she could live for another 30 years, 40 years, maybe even 50 years. And so half of her life was still ahead of her. There were no scars on her body to tell her that this is what has erupted, that has ruptured her body. But the scars were in her mind, in her memory. And she was struggling. What to do about it? And really, in some ways, unless we learn how to offer apology, how to forgive somebody, how to move on, really the whole force of life can remain frozen. And so this happens so many times in families, between brothers and sisters, between a son and a father, between a daughter and a mother. So we really need to learn, as a way of living, how to express our apologies for the breach of trust, for something we have done wrong, or the other person perceives that we have done wrong. So all these things are very crucial in really moving on and living fully to the full extent of one's capacities. Now, there are a number of theaters of war. We call them theaters of war, where the conflict arises. Where does it arise? Where does conflict arise? Well, as I mentioned, one of the areas of conflict is family. Family is where we relate most. Our emotions are expressed most deeply, most intimately in the family. And as we all know, certainly in the Western world, the family is going through big change. Then we are becoming, many families, we say, well, this is dysfunctioning families, or family structure of families is changing. So family is one area where the theater of war takes place. That's where conflict takes place. That's where love takes place. That's where intimacy takes place. The second area is our community. However we define that community. That community could be the church, it could be in a school, it could be in a political arena. That is our community. That's where we interact with other people. Then we have institutions. We work. I work in the university. That is my institution. That's why I interact with my colleagues. And then we have schools, you have office, you have banks where we work. That is our institution. Then our bigger institution, very large institution, are nations, countries. Countries give us a sense of welfare. They take care of our health. They do many things for us. We say, I'm an Australian, I'm a Canadian, I'm an Indian. It means many obligations, many rights, many responsibilities. So, and that's where a lot of conflicts arise as well. And then we have conflicts between nations. And so many countries, as we know, and I'm going to give you many examples, many countries have ruled other countries. They're imperial countries. They have ruled other countries. One of the countries that ruled greatly was Spain. Spain was one of the earliest great imperial powers. And when the Spaniards first arrived, for instance, people say the discovery of the New World in 1492. But for the New World, it was not a discovery. They think it was an assault. In 1492, when Columbus arrived, for a long time, for over 50 years, the question that the many Spaniards asked, that the people they have discovered, are they human or they're not human? A very good question. If they are not human, how can you convert them into Catholics, into Christians? And if they are human, how can you treat them so inhumanly? This question went on for 55 years, till 1555. So many people, many nations that have ruled other countries as the imperial power, whether it is Britain or France or Portugal or Denmark or Holland or other countries. So they have left many things in other countries. And people say, how can we make relations with those countries unless there is some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, some apology? And I'll give you a number of examples. And then, of course, the war within. Really, that is the great war that goes on in every human being. However much we may deny, much of our lives is lived within. I want to remind you that we talk more to ourselves than we talk to other people. We spend far more time talking to ourselves. And so we wonder, what are we talking? What are we saying? Who is listening to us? And then what language are we talking in? Is it English? Or is it language of hatred or resentment or love? What are we talking in? So these are the theaters of war. So let me start off with the first one. Today, this year, 2015, is the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian genocide. And it started in April 24. To this day, this was done, there were about 1.5 million people from Armenia, of Armenian origin, living in the Ottoman Empire, mostly in Turkey. They were butchered, they were killed. And to this day, 100 years later, Turkey refuses to acknowledge that anything of this kind happened. Or if it happened, it only happened in small measure. There is no acknowledgement, there is no apology, there is no reparations saying, well, this happened, this is why it happened, and we take responsibility for it. What does it do? It hurts the people, the minds of people, and the sense of belonging of the people of Armenian origin, every part of the world. There are many Armenians in Canada. I know some of them quite personally, quite well. And every conversation somehow veers around, saying it happened in 1915, 100 years ago, but it still stays fresh in their mind, because to this day, it has not been acknowledged that it happened. Now, many people think that this was the first genocide of the 20th century. That is not so, unfortunately. That is not so. The genocides, it's difficult to compare genocide. One genocide is better or worse than the other. Well, there were 2 other genocides that happened before that. The first genocide in the beginning of the 20th century, from 1904 to 1908, was done by Germany. And in the colony, the German colony in West Africa, in the Southwest Africa, today called Namibia. And so many hundreds of thousands of people were butchered there, killed there. And again, people who discovered history and try to find out why it happened, how it happened, to what extent it happened. And so, but many people say that that was the very first genocide of the 20th century. But for me, I want to refer to another genocide. And that genocide was done under the leadership of King Leopold of Belgium. And it happened in the Free State of Congo for the tapping of rubber and ivory. And during that time, the population of that area was estimated to about 20 million. By year 1908, that population had been reduced to 10 million. Over 10 million people were killed. 10 million people. This is the worst genocide in the human history, far worse than the Nazi genocide. So this is the first genocide conducted under the eye and interests of King Leopold of Belgium. To this day, Belgium has not acknowledged it, has not fully taken responsibility. It's only some historians who dig up this and find out and do research and say, how much was it, where did it happen, under what circumstances it happened. But many countries, and of course Congo has now become a different kind of country 100 years later, but many countries, many people say, how can you have good relationship with each other? How can 2 countries, 2 communities, people of 2 different races have good relations with each other unless you acknowledge that you did something wrong? Because acknowledgement has a very great healing power to it. And that's why I said the word I'm sorry is a very difficult word to utter for many countries, for many people. It's a very difficult word because in a way you are taking responsibility. Yes, I did it. I'm sorry I did it. I didn't quite fully understand why I did it, but I take responsibility. So to this day, Belgium, having committed the worst genocide in all of human history, more than 10 million people killed within a 20 years period. And I read to you a passage, a very touching passage. And it was written by a missionary to King Leopold. And he's visiting this area, and it's just amazing how the words. He says, I have just returned from a journey inland to the village of Insonga Maya. The abject misery and utter abandon is positively indescribable. I was so moved, Your Excellency, by the people's stories that I took the liberty of promising them that in future you will only kill them for crimes they commit. Interesting sense of justice, that you will only kill them only for the crimes they commit, not for other crimes. So this is a letter to Emperor Leopold, a chief agent in the Congo by missionary John Harris of Berenga. So many missionaries, many historians, many students, many people who feel that humanity needs to be we need to look at ourselves in order to see what have we done wrong and how can we make sure it is not done again. Let me bring you to something different. Some of you recall this picture. This comes from Vietnam in 1972. A girl walking down naked on a road in Vietnam. This girl, her name was, this is in 1972, she's 9 years old, and her name is Kim Phuc, P-H-U-C. And she was burnt by by napalm bomb that was thrown over this village, and she's running down this road, all burnt, her black all burnt. And this was the most prominent picture, most prominent photograph of in the war, and many people consider the turning point in the history of Vietnamese war. And when this picture came, and all newspapers all over the world carried this picture, and when this picture came, President Nixon, his first response, he was the president at the time, his first response that this can't be true. It must be doctored. It must, somebody's photographed has just put it together. It's a Photoshop job. And, but nevertheless, it was true. And so what happened to this girl? Good question. What happened? Did she survive? What happened to her mind? As I said to you, really so much of the theater of war, it goes on our heads. So what happened to this girl? Let's see. This is the girl. She's now 54 years of age. And she lives in Canada. She lives in Toronto. And she has, well, gone through a big transformation. Huge transformation. She's still alive. Her scars are still very visible. Here, this is the picture of a girl. Her name is Kim Phuc. She was 9 years old, running down the lane in a village in Vietnam as napalm bombs were explode over her village, and she's all burned from the back, and and so she's running down. She survived. So she's now 54 years of age. She lives in Toronto, and she has gone through an incredible inner transformation. And she's now representative of UNICEF for the United Nations as a person who speaks of love and mercy and forgiveness. And she has also taken on a great inner transformation of becoming a very religious person. And she utters these words, which I had a fortunate occasion to meet her once. And she said, "Forgiveness made me free from hatred. I still have many scars on my body and severe pain most days, but my heart is cleansed. Napalm is very powerful, but faith, forgiveness, and love are much more powerful. We would not have war at all if everyone could learn how to live with true love, hope, and forgiveness. If that little girl in the picture can do it, ask yourself, can you?" So this is I mentioned this because really it is a story that is well known. And the person who dropped the bomb, the person, one Jim Plummer, who then discovered that this is the girl who has suffered through this, and that he was the one person who had dropped the bomb, he went through a great inner trauma, suffered a great deal, became alcoholic, and really was suffering severe depression. They finally met each other. And there was a sense of her saying to him that, "I forgive you. You are not responsible for what you did." So there are many stories like this in which really people taking on a responsibility and then moving on, and in a way acknowledging what has been done and then moving on. Okay, it's working now. So let me now give you some example where, again, a denial, not acknowledging, and then what it did to. In 1942, in Poland, it was discovered that 22,000 Polish officers of the army were killed in a cemetery. And they were killed within an hour or so. And this is the great episode of Katyn, this town where it happened. For a long time, Soviet Union kept denying that it had anything to do with it, and that it was the Nazis who had killed so many people. And it was not until the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989 that it was discovered that it was done on the orders of Stalin. And this is the first time that Poland, after almost 45 years or so, heaved a sigh of relief that they could finally say who was really responsible for this massacre of 22,000 officers. And even though the pain was there, but the fact that it was finally not only found out who did it, but there was a certain degree of acknowledgement by the new Russian government that it was on Stalin's orders. So it is as I said, a country, a people, a nation, a group of people can hold a pain in their hearts for a long time, and it keeps festering, because unless there is a way of healing it, it keeps corroding inside and destroying you. And then as it was happening, interestingly, I show you here a picture on the top left side called Our Class. Even as Poland was discovering that it had its own officers were killed by the Soviets, they were discovering that there was an incident in Poland in which 1,500 Jewish people who lived in the same village with other people and who went to the class in the same school with other people, the 1,500 people were huddled in a house and they were set on fire and killed. And that too, the Polish people had denied that anything of this kind had ever happened. They said it was done by the Nazis. But the fact of the matter is, and it came out only in 2010 through a play written by one of the Polish writers. The name of the play is called Our Class. A wonderful play. I saw it in Toronto a few years ago. Wonderful play, very, very poignant play. It was discovered, sort of historical, literary research, that it was a group of people, the people of the same city, same school, same classmates, who had set their own classmates on fire just because they were Jewish people. So you see how a country, a society can have a strange set of complex set of emotions. On one hand, trying to see who did this to us, and they're discovering that the Soviets had done it, and they themselves now acknowledging or hesitantly or grudgingly acknowledging that they had done this to the other group of people, the Jewish people. So, anything. Then the other Holocaust that Stalin was responsible for in Ukraine. The hunger that killed more than 6 million people, the hunger that started by the new policies of Stalin in the 1930s. Again, not acknowledged, not acknowledged. No question of expressing apology, not acknowledged. And so when there's not an acknowledgement, what does it do to the people? It really, as I said, it destroys any sense of trust. You cannot build trust amongst people unless there is an acknowledgement that I had done something wrong. Now, since we have lost some time, so I've got to move fast. I mentioned this in one of my earlier lectures about this is called the comfort women in Japan. 200,000 of them were used by the Japanese army during the Second World War for their soldiers, young girls between the age of 18 and 25, many of them from the neighboring countries, Korea, China, Philippines. And again, and after the war was over, these women went back to their own countries and their own families, many of them never accepted by their families. But what is hurtful here, that Japan to this day has not acknowledged that anything of this kind happened, or anything of this kind happened or even to the extent that it happened. And so, as you can see in the pictures here, people now, many of these women, most of them have died away, but are struggling to have Japan acknowledge it. And because acknowledgement, again, there are memorials, there are history books, there are ways of saying that it will never be done again. So I mentioned in my other lecture how two of my students at the University of Toronto had brought 10 women of Korean origin to come and tell their story to the world. And they told their story on televisions and newspapers, and it became a great phenomenon of acknowledging what kind of genocide the Japanese committed during the Second World War in addition, in China and other places, but also with these comfort women, so-called comfort women. Now, it happened, unfortunately, in Bangladesh in 1971. Now, some of you may know the history that Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. But it is separated by India in between by a distance of over 1,000 miles. So you have what was called East Pakistan, and then you had West Pakistan, and you had India in between. So East Pakistan became Bangladesh. It became a separate country, and that happened in 1971. And it was a brutal war, the war for independence. And during that time, it is said, it is believed, it is well documented, that more than 3 million women were assaulted and raped, and then many of them killed. And brutal. And this is unfortunately has happened in so many wars. The women have been always been the butt of cruelty and torture and destruction. But again, Pakistan has never taken any responsibility for it. Now, it's a sad thing. Both countries were Muslim countries. It's not like only the religion that you express your anger and destructive tendencies against people of other religion. Both were Muslim countries. It was one Muslim country committing atrocities against other Muslim countries and against the women of their own country and never acknowledging it. So it stays a very sore point for the people of Bangladesh that what kind of brutalities were committed and how they again remain unacknowledged. Now, here I bring you to Canada and to Britain. Many people don't know, and many people in Canada didn't know this, that there was a phenomenon called home children. Between 1860 and 1939, a period of about 80 years, Britain sent more than 150,000 children to Canada. Children, they were people from the slums or orphanages or from the streets, or what used to be called bastard children, children born out of wedlock. And many of them shipped off to Canada, and they were shipped off, and they were to be paid in Canada $3 a year, and a trust fund, which is nobody ever received it. But many of these children were treated very badly in Canada, I'm sad to say. They were essentially working, doing all kinds of jobs, and as you know, Canada is very cold in the winter months, and many of them very poorly dressed. They never went to a school, never went inside of a church, so they were very brutally treated. Many of them, we don't even know where they are. This went on for such a long period of time. It's only recently, a few 5, 6 years ago, that some historians dug up this information, and then there were apologies expressed in the Canadian Parliament that this could happen to children coming from Britain. They're not coming from a third world country, from Africa. They were coming from Britain to Canada, both countries quite successful, quite rich, quite well off, and that this could go on for such a long period of time. And they're called home children. So the Prime Minister of Canada, Harper, expressed apologies that to its own people, they don't even know where they are. Nobody came forth and said, I am one of those children. Nobody came forth. And same way, apologies were expressed in the Parliament of England by the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Brown. And so both countries expressed apologies and, in a way, acknowledging that this is not something that could possibly happen now. But it did happen over a long period of time. It's called home children. And a stamp was issued at that time acknowledging and saying how the children were treated. And now, when I talk about it in Canada, many people in Canada are surprised by it because they don't even know that such a thing existed and how could it have existed and how these children were treated or abused and both sometimes sexually, what happened to them. Now, something even much bigger had happened in Canada to the native populations. Many of them were sent to residential schools, taken away from their indigenous population, taken away from their homes, and they were not allowed to speak their own languages and cut off from their cultures, whatever expression of culture. And they put in residential schools which were paid by the Canadian governments, and their schools were run by Anglican Church. And they went on till 1975, over a period of more than 100 years. And what was discovered that many of these children were not abused only physically, but sexually. And now it has become a multi-billion-dollar suit in Canada, litigation, and there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up to find out what happened, to what extent it happened, and what can be done about it. And so many apologies have been expressed and many ways of, again, acknowledging it. But it remains a black mark on in the history of Canada that so many people, of indigenous people who have lived there for far longer than people who came from Europe, and how they were treated in a way to civilize them, in a way to make them like ourselves so that they are not at the margins of civilized society. And this happened in the United States, it happened in Canada, and it happened probably many parts of Australia as well. I'm sorry to say I'm not well informed about the history of Australia, but certainly it is a very big issue in Canada. Now I mentioned these things about human beings, but really in a way there are animals who could ask us, how come humankind is not kind to us? And when would humankind will be kind? Because so many animals feel that they too have been not treated well, but they don't have voices, they don't write letters to the editor, they have no votes. So, but in a way we find that the rest of the animal kingdom we need to be, human beings need to be custodians for their well-being in order for them to be treated well. I still have to finish my talk on time here. So here let me give you another example of an experiment that went on for a long period of time, a medical experiment that went on in the United States called at the Tuskegee University. It was called Tuskegee experiment. It went on from 1929, during the beginning of the Depression, till 1974, a long period of time, almost 50 years. And this is an experiment on black people, Negroes, and this is at that time they were called Negro or niggers. And experiment was a syphilis. They were suffering from syphilis. And the penicillin, which was the cure for syphilis at the time, was discovered. But the experiment was to find out what course would syphilis take on its own if no treatment is given to them. No, they were not told, these people were picked from the crowd, they were not told firstly that they are suffering from syphilis, and they were not told what is being done to them, and many of them suffered miserably, and many of them died away. And it is only until, it was not until 98 that it was found out that this experiment had been conducted, and it had very definite racial tones to it. And then it became a big, huge scandal in the United States, the Tuskegee experiment, to the extent that Bill Clinton, the president, expressed his apology to the whole country. And there's only one or two or three people, surviving people. You see one of them, Clinton, talking to one of these people at the time. And Clinton said, and he is considered a man who was considered a president who was generally sympathetic to the black people. He said, the people who ran the study at Tuskegee diminished the stature of man by abandoning the most basic ethical precepts. They forgot their pledge to heal and repair. They had the power to heal the survivors and all the others, but they did not. Today, all we can do is offer our apologies. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I'm sorry. To our African American citizens, I'm sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so clearly racist. Now, that happened in 98, but 10 years later, historians, this is the great wonder of living in an open society. America is probably the most open society. So historians, academics, intellectuals, journalists find things which would otherwise be hidden away. They certainly were hidden away in the Soviet Union. They were hidden away in China, many countries which are not open. So you people, historians, intellectuals, are scared to conduct any such study. But USA is a very open society. And from that point of view, very admirable society. So 10 years later, in 2010, there was another experiment that had been conducted, and it had been conducted not in USA, but in Guatemala. It was also a syphilis experiment. And so this time, it was not President Clinton who expressed apology, it was his wife, Hillary Clinton, as the Secretary of State. She expressed apology. What did she say? She said, we deeply regret, this is in October 2010, that it happened, this study that went on in Guatemala. And we apologize to all the individuals who were affected by such aberrant research practices. Many medical experiments have been conducted on people who are on the margin. And so we feel this is about time that the humanity of everyone, however poor or vulnerable he may be or she may be, whether they're women or children, or they're black people or people of certain caste, that whoever they are, they have a dignity, they have a right to be human. And so if they are mistreated, who is responsible for it? Now, the great potato famine of Ireland of 1840s. Now, during that time, as we know, millions of Irish people died, and they were. This is a time when Britain, England, had all the resources to help them, but there were excuses made that this is the law of nature, that this is how it must take its due course, and no help was offered to the Irish people. It stays. This particular memorial is in Dublin, and it was only in '97 that Prime Minister Tony Blair, expressed apology on behalf of England. Now, many people feel that, well, Tony Blair was not the Prime Minister at the time. That is many years earlier. But in a way, in order to make sure that the pain and the resentments and anger and rage does not continue to fester, whosoever is the Prime Minister or the Queen or the King at the time, they must take responsibility for their history. It's not for the present, but for their historical event. So Tony Blair said, the famine was a defining event in the history of Ireland and Britain. He acknowledged. It has left deep scars. That 1 million people should have died in what was then part of the richest and most powerful nation in the world is something that still causes pain as we reflect on it today. Those who governed in London at the time failed their people. So it shows a certain maturity on the part of a country, of a nation, that they take responsibility for their action, even though they may have happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It is in the same spirit that Pope Paul II went to Jerusalem, to Israel, in the year 2000, and expressed apologies for the treatment of Jewish people for 2,000 years by the Catholics, the anti-Semitism, and all that it entailed. You know, many people forget that the Jewish people were treated badly, far more badly by the Christians, particularly Catholics, than ever by the Muslims. Muslims had welcomed them in many countries. They were very well treated. But it was the Christian. So it was in the year 2000 that John Paul II offered apology for the treatment of the Jewish people and of course, the Holocaust that had occurred earlier. So that new relations could be established. A new relation, because we are a family. The world is becoming a family. And unless the family people have the courage to say, I'm sorry what had happened, so we cannot move on. Because increasingly we are doing more trade with each other. We are visiting each other. We are traveling to each other's countries. We are sending students to study in each other's countries. We are becoming a human family, which has never quite existed in that manner before. So in order for the family to work, you have to learn to take responsibility for what we may have done to the brother and sister and so on. This is another story of the Chinese treatment of the Chinese in Canada and other places as well. But Chinese people came to Canada to build a railroad from one end of the country to another end in the 1880s. It was the most amazing technological advance in the country. A huge undertaking, especially going to the mountains. But the Chinese were not treated very well. Firstly, they were not being paid very well. And then a special tax was imposed on them called head tax that went on till 1922 or so. And so it's only now that the people in governments in China and the people in Canada are expressing apology for how they were treated, so the Chinese could become full and integral members of New Canada. And now they are indeed very successful people in Canada and have a very honorable place. But many Chinese have, until recently, until the apologies were expressed, have felt that they were being treated as second-class citizens. They're not being treated equally, not fairly. So this remains, again, a very important feature of. Now, we have a day of remembrance. November 11th is Day of Remembrance. My next talk is about First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. and I'll talk about the day, how the Day of Remembrance came, November 11. This is as the treaty was going on in France, peace treaty was going on in 1919. There was something happened by the British committed an incredible atrocity in India, in the city of Amritsar, in a place called Jallianwala Bagh, a garden, a park, where people were meeting on a religious festival, and without any warning, without any provocation, without nothing of the kind, they shot down about 450 people. And within 1 hour, a commander, an English commander, literally went crazy, went berserk. And so this happened in 1919, so almost 100 years ago. So that when the Queen visited India, she's still shying away from expressing apology for saying, because in a way the head of the state, but the Prime Minister, Cameron, when he visited, he took responsibility. He said this was wrong, this is inhuman, this is not correct, this is not acceptable behavior, however it happened. This is 100 years ago, and India was a British colony at that time. And India had sent more than 1.5 million people to fight on behalf of the British in the First World War. And so many thousands of them had died there. So it seems strange that their own people were being killed back on, without any provocation, in the city of Amritsar. So here is the interesting turn of events. They recently, just a month ago, they installed the statue of Gandhi in the Parliament Square in London. And this is the Prime Minister Cameron offering tribute to him. And so this is a turning around. History is turning around, as if there's a new way of relating to each other. And it has become necessary. It has become almost a new imperative that we acknowledge each other as a human being, because the family of man. Now, I have to rush here. So I say, is this a new kind of politics that is emerging? And remark that Gandhi made, a very beautiful remark, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. And this idea of revenge, because we have, until recently, I said to you, live in the animal kingdom, this phenomenon of fight and flight, but we have also, when we can't fight back, we say we'll take revenge whenever we are in a position to take revenge, and people have taken revenges. That's how we have lived. But now we say, no, revenge, we must not take law in our own hands. And law, so whose hand should law be in? So this idea of justice and law emerging as a new civilizing force, and this idea then that we don't, it said if we, everyone, an eye for an eye, really how the whole world will become blind. I don't have time to talk about this amazing thing that happened in a school in Pennsylvania in the year 2005, in an Amish school, how the children were killed by a man who had gone berserk, and how the whole community had forgiven this man and taken on his 3 children and started a trust fund for them, and really forgiven them, forgotten them, no sense of hatred against them. A remarkable achievement, truly a remarkable phenomenon. Much written about, much talked about, and made into a very beautiful film as well. This idea that people can be brutal, do awful things to you, and these 5 girls were killed in a most brutal way, and yet how the community forgave them and moved on. So I will finish on here saying, am I my brother's keeper? And how am I my brother's keeper? These are really new phenomena. This is a term this is a line that comes from the Bible in a way, but really now we need to talk about it in more secular terms, in a more practical terms, because of the new family of human beings everywhere. It is in Australia and Canada, USA and China, everywhere. We say how people can live with each other, with dignity, with respect, with equality, with justice, with fairness, because these are new commands of our new expressions of our humanity in a manner which we have never experienced before. So the word of apology, the word of I'm sorry, for asking for forgiveness, asking yourself asking the other for forgiveness, and also forgiving yourself, because many times we have done things wrong to others, or the others have done to us. So this is a relationship value that is become increasingly crucial, and it's become imperative that countries establish relationship with each other and with each communities, so that is seen to be right. I have mentioned to you how Japan has so few immigrants because people feel they do not wish to go to live in Japan even after 70 years because of the way they were treated in China or Korea or Philippines. But other countries, A remarkable example is Germany, how Germany has taken responsibility for the behavior of the Nazis during that period, how they have created museums, how they make it part of their history, and they have created memorials so that they say, yes, we did it. It was wrong, what our people did. Whereas Japan never did it. Japan did not acknowledge what it did to us. And so these are important features of life, of relationship with each other, which in every way distinguish greatly from the animal kingdom. We are special. We need to understand how we are special. And we can live and learn to live as special creatures on this earth. Thank you very much.